Good morning. Today I'm just going to take a couple of minutes in our Bible and talk about worship. But before we get there, I like history, and if you pay attention to much of what I do, I read little bits and pieces of history here and there and try and pick things up. I think we're crazy to not know where we came from and what those people believed that went before us. And if you read enough history, you can identify the liars today because they're saying the same thing the liars did back then. But anyway, I was thinking today about a message from the evangelist Sam Gipp. Maybe you've heard him, maybe you haven't. But I personally, my opinion, I think Sam Gipp's the sharpest guy in America right now in the King James Bible. Facts and statistics and information. He doesn't just rant and rave, but he gives facts. And I love knowing what we believe has got some substance, not just what I've always been taught. But he brought a message, and I scribbled some notes on it. And you could look at this whole message up online if you were to Google Sam Gipp and King James Stewart. And this is about King James, who was the one who commissioned the translating of our Bible. And there's a lot more that Brother Gipp put down than these. They're just some things, some scribbles I put down about him. First, he rejected Roman Catholicism when he was 11 years old. At 22 years old, he debated a Jesuit priest 5 times publicly. And the Jesuit priest conceded that the king won. This When he was 5 years old, he became king, or when he became, or maybe 5 when he was little. But at 5 years old, he addressed the regents, the people who were kind of running the country while he was growing up. And at 5 years old, he said to the regents, "Be careful what you do, because you'll answer to God and to me afterwards." And I think this is a guy with some grit, even as a little boy. He had some strength. His mother was a Catholic. His son became a Catholic, but in between, he was definitely not a Catholic. He ran the Jesuits out of town, and basically, the priests, the people tried to have him killed. He was kidnapped. He was kidnapped twice as a child. He resisted attempts to kidnap him 3 different times, and he managed to flee from 5 different plots to kill him. And the people that knew him in that era said he faced danger and difficulty with energy and with courage. He wrote a little thing to his son, and I can't even pronounce it, the Basilicon Doron or something like that. But he had a list of things to his son that he wanted his son to be aware of. And one of the things he said, first and foremost, the king needs a relationship with God. Secondly, he said he needs to be, and he wrote about his duties of office, and we'll get to some of those. And then third, his manners, his relationships, and his etiquette. Those are the 3 areas. He wrote to his son about his relationship to God, his relationship to government, and his relationship to manners. But here's a couple things. In his personal life, he told his son Henry, "Don't be uncivil in eating like a gross cynic, nor vestiges like a dainty Dane." He told his son, "Eat in a manly, round, and honest fashion." We don't understand all those terms exactly what he's meaning, but he was certainly interested in his boy being a man. And he read a lot. He had people reading to him. Regarding the king's appearance, he writes to his son, "His garments should be proper, clean, comely, honest, and suitable for the occasion. Armor should be worn if he went to war, unless he was wishing to run away from the war. And if he's thinking of leaving battle, he should wear lighter armor." He goes on, "Effeminate things, such as long hair or nails or perfume, must be avoided." He was very anti-effeminate. And of course, there's critics who'd like to make him into a problem, but I'd like those critics to get critical of the people who translated all these other Bibles. Excuse me. Regarding smoking, he wrote a little thing, an anti-smoking tract. What king ever does that? And here's some things he wrote. By the way, he was a hunter. He was a very avid hunter. He had problems with his legs, a disease, and so they had to tie him to his horse. And he hunted the woods free of game, so they had to start importing game. And he hunted, and he loved to hunt. He's very outdoorsy. But in regard to smoking, he said this: it's loathsome to the eyes, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. He went on to say the reason people do smoke, it's the nature of self-love, that we cannot be content unless we imitate what our fellows do, and so prove ourselves capable of doing everything they are capable of doing, like apes, counterfeiting the manners of others. But in regard to the husband that smoked, he said, that husband shall not be ashamed to reduce thereby his delicate and wholesome, clear-complexioned wife to that extremity, that either she must also corrupt her sweet breath therewith, or else resolve to live in a perpetual stinking torment. Here's a guy who had some strength, some convictions. In regard to sin, he said, there are some horrible crimes you are bound in conscience never to forgive, such as witchcraft, willful murder, incest, and sodomy. It's an insult to call this man feminine, to call him queer, anything. He certainly was not. At age 8, people talk about his intellect. He was brilliant. At age 8, he could read any chapter in the Bible, and then he could read it in Latin, and then do a running translation into French, and then translate the French into English. And that's as an 8-year-old. And he had all that vocabulary already. The guy was brilliant. He said to others he considered himself a member of the pre-500 AD primitive church. He traced his beliefs back to those who were Waldenses or the Albigensians. Just some things about him. And I think sometimes we're too quick to just accept what people say. History says we ought to look a little bit, and these things are all from the letters that either King James wrote or people that lived with him wrote, and that's some things. So anyway, 2 Kings chapter 16. By the way, the more I read my Bible, and the more I read about the Bible, and the more I read about our history, the stronger Baptist I am, the stronger adherent I am to the King James Bible, and the stronger I am in soul winning, the stronger I am in separation. The more I read, the more I realize what these traditional fundamental values that have been given to me by my leaders, they're things I cling to by fact and history and scriptural truth. And as the years go by, I get stronger, not weaker. But I've talked a little bit about this in some areas about this thing of worship. We are in this area of worship, these worship services, and how do you worship? And I love your church's style of worship, and that just kills me, these phrases that have nothing to do. You never find it in your New Testament. We got an Old Testament. If you've not familiar with covenants, there's some things God did with Abraham, and then with Moses, and then David. And when Christ came, it's a New Testament. The law and the prophets were until John, the Bible says. The law came by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness. There's lines drawn here. But in our New Testament, basically our church doctrine, what our church practices and believes, is written pretty much through the Pauline epistles. So if you go from Romans to the book of Philemon, pretty well that is our church basis for our beliefs. Now, there's things all through the Bible that we get for our church, lessons and doctrines and principles from all the Bible, Genesis to Revelation. But as far as how the church is to operate, we find him in the writings of the Apostle Paul. And I've written and talked about this a little bit along the way, and depending on what you've heard or not heard, but in the 13 books between Romans and Philemon, the word worship's only 6 times, and it's so minimally addressed, and it's certainly not teaching us anything. Now, I am for worship, but as you go through your whole New Testament, I've gone through every verse many times. Worship in the New Testament is usually one person or a very few people just on their face saying, Jesus walked on the water, and whoa, they fell down and worshiped him. They knew he was somebody special. Peter came into Cornelius' house, and Cornelius and the people, Cornelius fell down and worshipped him. Worship is not this public rock concert, light show, everybody swaying like a, and that atmosphere is the secular rock concerts of the 70s. I was invited right after, I hadn't been saved very long, I was invited to a concert and I went, and one Christian concert, and I'd only been to a couple of secular concerts, but I thought there's no difference here. The crowd, the physical, the physical air of the audience, audience response. It's just a secular crowd with some different lyrics. It's certainly nothing Christian. But in 2 Kings chapter 16, there's a story here. The king went to Damascus. 2 Kings 16:10. King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, and he saw an altar that was at Damascus. An altar, if you remember, in the tabernacle, that curtained place of worship in the Old Testament, they entered the tabernacle. The first thing you see is the altar. It's where the animals were cut, their throat cut, the blood collected, the animal, various things done. But the altar is what they put the animal on, and it was burnt as an offering to God, and then there was other things going on. But secular people had altars. I was in Mexico on a pyramid, and you climb up these stairs to the top of the pyramid, and all around the steep sides of the pyramids, there's hooks, like stone hooks. And at the top, there's this flat place up there. And of course, the new people, the warm and fuzzy people, they say, yeah, then the ancient Indians, they brought their grains and their different things to offer to God here. But they offered human sacrifices and animal sacrifices. And they said the hooks were in case you slipped and started to slide down, you had something to hang on to. No, the hooks were if you tried to run away before they got to burn you alive, the hooks caught you. And anyway, people from all religions do sacrifices. Satan models everything God does. And from the very beginning of time, there's been sacrifices. Abel offered a blood offering, a blood sacrifice, and Cain offered his vegetables and all. But so the king sees this altar in this heathen place up in Damascus. And in verse 10, he sent the fashion of the altar, or a drawing, to Urijah the priest and said, I want you to build one like it. And so in verse 11, Urijah the priest built the altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. And so Urijah the priest made it against King Ahaz came from Damascus. When the king was come, he saw the altar. Well, he was happy about that. So there's several things wrong in the story. First of all, this backslidden king is modeling his worship and his sacrifices after the world, the unsaved world. That's not God's plan. Secondly, he sees this heathen altar, and of course the altar he had, he's probably, I'm just guessing here, 300 years after Solomon. And so the altar Solomon made was old. It was like a King James Bible. It's several hundred years old. Can't we get something more modern that looks a little better? Can't we get the atmosphere of our church service a little better? I mean, just preaching in some old hymns. We need some updated things. And that kind of a thing was going on. And in chapter 16, verse 11, so he made it. And now, so in verse 11, we got a problem. Urijah the priest, he's taking orders from the king. That's not the priest's job. If our president or our governor gave me orders about how to run my church service, I wouldn't give them the time of day. It is none of their business how we worship. It's none of their business how we go to church. None of their business how I preach or what I preach. That's not the government's job. The government always wants to run the church, and it did. That's what Protestantism and Catholicism, there was a marriage between government and church, but not Bible believers. It's never been that way. So first of all, the king's modeling the world. Secondly, the preacher is listening and taking instructions from the king instead of from the King of Kings, and that's what he should have done. You go down to verse 14, it says, and he brought also the brazen altar, that was the right one, that was before the Lord from the forefront of the house, from between the altar and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the altar. And so he took the original altar and he just put it over on the side. In case we need it, it's there. But he wanted his new thing. So when people came into the temple, they saw this, wow, whatever, carved, engraved, colored, who knows what, but this new altar. And the old-fashioned altar, it's kind of stuck over there on the side. He put it out of the way. Ahaz knew he might need that old altar because he might need, and it says he might need, look at verse 15. And Ahaz commanded Urijah the priest, saying, upon the great altar burn the morning burnt offerings and the evening meat offerings, and the king's burnt sacrifice and his meat offerings. At the end of it says, in the brazen altar, the end of verse 15, and the brazen altar shall be for me to inquire by. That altar over there, that old-fashioned altar, that's where I'll go if I need information from God. This altar, it's the new one. It's the cool one. It's the one that everybody's going to wow and they see it. That one, that's where we want to meet God. He knew this thing didn't have God's presence or God's blessing. So he kept the old one, but he didn't want it too close. And pitiful thing. So you look at these stories. I remember many years ago, I don't go to Christian bookstores now. That to me, they just make me mad. Been, I don't know, decades probably since I've been to a Christian bookstore. But when we started the church, I would go. There's nothing around here. But I remember going to a Christian bookstore and they had a TV going with a video of a very famous Christian singer, a lady. And the volume was turned down. But I don't know if you could buy the videos or what. But and then later in the day, my wife and I, there was 1,000 people in Wildomar. There wasn't a lot of business. There were only 10,000 people in Lake Elsinore, 10,000 in Temecula, and 1,000 in Murrieta. So this whole valley only had 22,000 people in 4 different cities put together. And now our city, Wildomar's got a booming 34,000 or something. But so we'd have to go to Riverside or Oceanside to any kind of a store. But so we go to that Christian bookstore, and I'm thinking it was Riverside, and then we went to the mall for whatever reason, eat or whatever. And we're walking along, and here's a very famous singer. You that are over 50 would know the name. If I gave it, I can remember it. But we're walking through the mall, and there's a TV in front of a secular music store, or like a record store, and a video of this very famous lady vocalist, volume turned down. And I looked at her, and I thought about the Christian bookstore, and had you put those two side by side, you would not be able to tell me which one was the Christian. Their dress was the same, their gestures and their body movements were the same, their sensuous atmosphere, it was all the same, the caressing of the mic was the same. There was nothing different between those two girls if you didn't hear the lyrics. And see, the secular or the Christian musician was modeling the secular musician to try and get in a bigger audience or whatever, I don't know. But folks, we're not supposed to go to the world to learn how to do the things of God. We've got a book here, and we've got the Holy Spirit in here. We've got the Great Commission to obey. I'm not supposed to go to the world, to their rock concerts, to their music. I'm not supposed to go to the world's attitudes and learn their vocabulary. I'm not supposed to go to the world for their dress. I'm not supposed to go to the world for their nothing. This world passes away, and all the things that are in it, they're all worthless. I'm supposed to go to God, and I'm supposed to go to his book for guidance. But here, this Ahaz, he sees some cool new thing of worship out in the world, and so he brings it into the house of God. He takes the old way of approaching God and puts it over to the side. You know, when we remodeled our auditorium, the pews were a mess and carpet and everything. And we were talking about what to do. Well, to reupholster the pews was going to cost more money than putting in chairs for the auditorium. And we talked about it. And then also, we've needed a fellowship hall forever. We've never had one. And if you're thinking, why not? Because you need to write the check. We've got a building slab, electric, and the underground stuff, plumbing and all that underground in its place. We're just waiting for $1 million or so, $1.5 million. So we hashed around the ideas and finally decided on chairs in the auditorium because we could move the chairs, put tables in there, and we could do some things that we couldn't do with pews. and for like a third of the price or something, because the reupholstering of the pews and fixing the the staining of the pews and stuff was so very expensive. But I'll tell you what I like about our church. A few times, as we were talking about it among different people, it was just pews say church. And when we made the decision to go with chairs, and we put them in there, and of course everybody liked it. It's pretty, the pretty wooden platform, and the everything. It looks so nice. But on several occasions, some of our members said, "Pastor, I like pews. I'm not against this, but I like pews. Pews say church. They don't say rock concert. They don't say lecture hall. They say church." And I love that our church is hanging on. As long as our church is concerned about what chairs they're in, we are likely to stay fundamental. It's like we were some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, we were talking about school rules, because there are rules we have in our school handbook for, especially for appearance, that are just cultural, and their timing. We wanted our young ladies to be sharp, and sharp meant in most circles, weddings and professional people and office attire meant knee length at least skirts and nylons. Well, we have knee length or longer skirt belief because of the Bible. It talks about the nakedness of showing the thigh, and so we were not going to change on that. But nylons, that was a question. But when it got where people in weddings aren't wearing nylons, and people in politics aren't wearing nylons, and people in professional business offices aren't wearing nylons, then why are we asking our girls to do something that none of the professional world does? And so we made a decision. There's nowhere in the Bible it says that thou shalt wear nylons. Well, the same thing came up with sleeves on ladies' clothing. Now, we've always felt like the modesty is having something to keep the right motion from looking into, from making the underneath of your blouse visible as a lady. And so there's a discussion, a sleeveless that is fairly tight, or a cap sleeve, or a half sleeve, or whatever. What do we want? And I like that our families were concerned that we stay modest. You're not going to get too modest. You may get unsociably acceptable, but the danger is losing our standards. And I love that our church is clinging to conservative and old values. So we start talking about worship. We don't need to model our worship. Now, I don't believe the word worship applies to the church service. I don't call our church service a worship service. I don't even like the name service. I think it's a Catholic term, I think. But the preaching service, the preaching meeting, the church gathering, whatever you want to call it, the vocabulary kind of merges with the times. But you just get, I don't want us to model our church gathering after a bunch of unsaved people. That is so unscriptural. But you look over a little bit further, it gets even worse. If you look down at verse 19, I'm in 2 Kings 16 still. Now the rest of, that's not the right verse. I wrote the wrong verse down there. And there it is, verse 17. And King Ahaz cut off the borders of the bases and removed the laver from off them, and took down the sea from off the brazen oxen that were under it, and put it upon a pavement of stones. And so it wasn't just a new altar. It was that, see, the altar, when you walked in, the first thing you saw was bloodshed and fire. It was a reminder of the horrible, horrible price of sin. Behind the altar was this laver, and in the tabernacle in the wilderness they traveled, it was small, but it was brass, and the priest would wash his hands symbolically. I have no right to enter in the presence of God if I'm not clean. But his there's so much more to it than that. I won't go into it, because down by his feet it was all so very symbolic. But when Solomon built the temple, he built this huge laver and put it on the back of these brass oxen. And so when you came in, you saw the blood and the fire, a reminder of the horribleness of sin. And there, way up high, was the laver to remind you, you have to be clean. That laver was a reminder you have to be washed. You have to be a clean person. And God, you don't approach God with the filth of this world on you. Internally is the New Testament doctrine. Externally is the picture in the Old Testament. So Ahaz goes along. Now that he gets the new altar, then he cuts the laver off and gets rid of the oxen, and he put the laver down on the ground. And that's bad enough. But look at why he did it. Verse 18, and the covert for the Sabbath that they had built in the house and the king's entry without turned he from the house of the Lord for the king of Assyria. He changed the way everything was set up for a heathen king. He started out by seeing something he liked. He brought it in. Then he lowered the laver and the cleansing, and he made that down low and not so prominent. And then he changed this covert. I won't go into what all that is, but he changed that for the king of Assyria. You know who should be the reason we do what we do? For God, not for some heathen king. I love Carl Laurent. He's in heaven now. He was one of my Bible teachers in college. And every day in class, when we closed class, he prayed a prayer. Whatever prayer he prayed, he closed with this: Lord, help us do what we do because of you. And that ought to be the marching orders of the child of God. That world should not control you. Jesus should. And let's don't modify our worship to match this old world that can't even figure out who they are, what they are, where they're going. We have a great God and a great Bible. Let's be loyal to him.